absolutely we need to keep wolves out of Colorado for the preservation of livestock production. Wolves are an incredibly effective predator, not only for livestock, but out in the woods when folks are hunting, biking, trail riding, hiking. You know, a wolf doesn't really care what type of meat he eats. He just wants meat, and he's effective at getting it.
Activists are planning to release 500 wolves into Colorado, possibly putting farmers, their livestock, and their livelihoods at risk. And others are taking notice.
We're having more wolves there, and we need to do a better job. Yes, we need to conserve, but we also need to manage them. We've had our first wolf down in southern Oregon. It was a killer wolf. It killed approximately 30 head of sheep. And so ODF&W right now is working on updating the wolf plan, and our Oregon Farm Bureau has been involved in those discussions.
Tonight, hear advice and stories from those impacted by wolves and what it could mean for you. Good evening and welcome to Rural America Live. I'm Arlen Bowling. Tonight we are joined by a wildlife and ranch experts with Big Game Forever to talk about the dangers of wolves. And we want to warn you, some of the images and videos you will be seeing are of a graphic nature, but we're showing them to you to help illustrate the importance of tonight's topic. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I appreciate it so much. Thanks for coming in. Glad to have you with us here.
Pleasure to be here.
We're going to start with Denny Behrens. You're the Colorado State Director of Big Game Forever, correct?
That's right, Marlon.
All right, give us a little background on that, if you would.
Okay, Big Game Forever was formed back in 2010 when sportsmen and landowners across the West, especially in Oregon and Idaho and Montana, that were being affected by the fact that wolves were starting to depredate on big game animals. And they were seeing moose and elk populations start to decline. And so the sportsmen felt like, hey, we've got to get something done in Washington, D.C. And so they held a number of banquets, raised about $2 million, and they actually formed Big Game Forever. Our CEO and founder, Ryan Benson, is a Harvard attorney, and he has done an excellent job as far as getting us involved in this wolf issue ever since.
So are there wolves in Colorado?
Absolutely. We have dispersal wolves coming in from Wyoming, and the thing that we're seeing is that those wolves have been traveling into Colorado since about 2004, and there's documentation of 5 wolves that have come into Colorado, and you can even go on the division's website and actually see a video of a black wolf in the snow.
All right. Now, is there a movement to actually introduce wolves into Colorado right now?
Yes, there is. The Rocky Mountain Wolf Project and the Ted Turner Endangered Species Fund back in July told our Director of Parks and Wildlife that they were going to push for a ballot initiative to introduce wolves into the state of Colorado. And that's what got us alarmed. That's why we formed the coalition to stop this.
Now, you actually have some sponsors that are backing you up on this, right?
Absolutely.
So who do you have working with you?
We have La Plata Farm Bureau's working with us. We also have the Four Corners SCI, Colorado chapter of SCI. We've got the Farm Bureau and a number of other individuals that have joined with us.
All right. Now we want to bring in Scott Rockham. All right. You're the CEO and you're the founder of Rockham Media Group, and also Save the Western Wildlife. Now, explain that. What is that?
Save Western Wildlife was formed to be an independent, small group of people with efficiency to go after these environmentalists and their wolf agenda.
Now, why did you feel obligated to get involved in this?
Early on, it hit me while I was hunting, and it in 1 year destroyed my hunting. The wolves did. The wolves moved in simply 1 year, destroyed my hunting. And as I sought to seek answers for it, I also found out that the cattlemen were getting hammered as well. And somewhere along the line, it angered me enough to kick me into action.
Now, were there wolves there in Idaho before 1995?
Absolutely. Montana and Idaho had been doing studies for years, and they started out with the 1978 Weaver study, and this Weaver study, they count upwards of 500 outfitter accounts of wolves in Yellowstone. during the period of that study. We also had wolves in North Idaho. We had wolves of Central Idaho, and both of those were aimed at showing that we did have wolves, because the intended purpose of those two studies was to shut down logging and to shut down public land grazing and cattle.
And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they didn't know that? They didn't react to it, or what?
Yes, they very much knew that. They ignored there was some triggers that would have stopped wolf introduction in itself. And all they had to do was find 3 pairs of wolves in Idaho, and the 2 biological aids did absolutely nothing at all to show that we had wolves. On the other hand, we had a very good biologist working in Montana, found 47 wolves, but instead of stopping it right there, they just rammed the whole thing through.
So is there any evidence to support the unlawful release of wolves in, as far as you've been able to discover here?
Yes, absolutely. I did a FOIA request, multiple FOIA requests, uncovered permits that were signed illegally by Idaho Fish and Game, Jerry Conley. A week later, the wolf release was initiated. And one very striking find that I found in all of this was the fact that they never, I got a hold of the vet check records from the Canadian folks that gave us those wolves, and not a single wolf was tested or prevented or treated for any disease whatsoever, with the exception of rabies.
So there were goals set in place then by the Fish and Wildlife Service at one point, right? Were they adhered to at all?
Well, pre-release, no, and post-release, no. They constantly moved the goalpost, and they had never intended on meeting their own objectives at 10 pairs per state at a total of 300 wolves. It went far beyond that. We're in the thousands of wolves now.
So do the people of Idaho and for example, Montana and Wyoming, do they feel like maybe the Fish and Wildlife Service has maybe let them down to an extent?
I would say it's a little stronger than that. It's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife is responsible for the greatest man-made disaster in all time in Idaho.
So why did these states get delisted? What did it take to do that?
We had a small group of folks. We had the Idaho Anti-Wolf Coalition that worked very hard. My group worked very hard, and we formed a coalition, and we put a lot of political pressure in Boise. And with the help of a couple of legislators, they asked me to help them write HB 343. That kicked off a flurry of panic from the federal government, because they've been dragging their feet. And we basically exerted our 10th Amendment right to protect our people, health and human safety, and our livestock.
Can you go into more detail? Explain what that means when you delist something like we're talking about here. Explain what's involved in that, can you?
Yes. When an animal is listed on the endangered species list, it's hands off. You can't do anything management, depending on what the plan reads. But in our case, our federal guys could have done a lot more control to prevent the damages they caused, and they didn't do that. And when we got delisting, there was strings attached with that. We had to wait 5 years before we can have full control by the state. We had limited activity on hunting and trapping, which kept the whole game going. And in the meantime, our wildlife really got hammered, even during that delisting process, but the ranchers did as well. It never ended.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Now, you also have noticed quite a decline in the elk herd, haven't you?
Absolutely. I've spent the last 13 years filming in Yellowstone, and I flew the first privately funded independent aerial survey of the northern Yellowstone elk herd, and we went from 19,000 elk down to what my count showed at 938 animals, 0 bulls. The important part of that is, in all of that scenario, that the Fish and Game departments and the feds downplayed it the entire time.
Now, we're looking at some video right now of some elk, and it's fascinating to watch from one perspective, but you were telling me before we came on the air, this entire herd that we're looking at here
This is prior
did
to
not survive, right?
Yes, sir. Prior to the delisting, at this particular place, there was 90 bulls, bachelor bulls. And at that same time, they told us that wolves only killed the sick and the weak. But what we can observe here is that 90 bulls, bachelor bulls, were killed in 30 days by 11 wolves.
90
bulls in 30 days.
That's just hard to believe.
That's just what they do.
And it's such a large animal. Just amazing to me that can happen.
Their form of attack is stress first, weaken the animals, and then they just pick them off one at a time.
I think what people would be surprised at is they're not even consumed, are they?
Not at all. Very, very little. They do as much killing for sport as they do for food. And I would say in some cases, like in this case, it was many times higher.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And thanks for sharing that video there. Just a fascinating and crazy video here. I wanted to turn to Phil Davis here for a second, if I could. And Phil, you're actually a rancher.
Yes.
In Idaho, central Idaho, is that correct?
Yeah, north of Boise.
Give us a little background, if you would, about yourself and your operation there and how you got involved in this.
Well, I'm actually the fourth generation rancher in Idaho. My great-grandfather started out in the Boise Valley, took water out of the Boise River and started feeding the miners up in Idaho City back in before the turn of the century, the other century. And we were involved in this early, and unfortunately we lost the second and third calves in the state of Idaho. And I was also involved prior to the introduction of wolves in Idaho in getting involved in the town hall meetings and things when we were being told that wolves weren't going to be an issue for livestock, probably wouldn't kill very many, probably wouldn't have a big effect on the elk.
And when was this?
It was prior to '96 when they were brought in. They tried to come and do scoping for the communities and see what people's opinion was and how much resistance there was to it. And we were told that it really probably wasn't going to affect us very much. And ironically, I wish I knew who this person was. I was in one of those meetings and he got me in the back of the room and because I'd commented quite a little and he says, yeah, these wolves are going to affect your livestock quite a bit. He says, they will train their young on your livestock in probably August and September. And I go, really, why is that? And he goes, well, the elk will be up high. The wolves will be denned down low in the valley floor where your livestock are, and that's what they'll train their pups on. And boy, have we seen it.
Really? Okay, we were just showing a graphic here on the screen about myopathy. And if we could bring that back up again, here you go, predator myopathy. Explain what we're looking at here, could you? I know it's kind of graphic, but anyway, what is really happening here?
That cow's alive. She has been ran to the point of total exhaustion. Chances are, from the looks of it, she may have just calved even. And so the wolves will run her until she's totally exhausted, till she can't go anymore. Myopathy is a situation where the animal exerts itself to the point that the oxygen in its system can't keep the muscles alive. The muscles begin to die. And myopathy, there's different levels of it to where they will die in, I suppose, minutes, although that's one issue is we don't have the research on this that we need. But I don't know how long it takes, maybe minutes, but they can also live for days, hours, or weeks, even years, depending on the level of myopathy. This cow obviously is not going to live very long. She's down. She can't get up. And that, it isn't the bite of the wolf that causes this. The bite starts the chase. And then the animal fears for its life and chase until it absolutely can't go anymore. And quite often left alive. And we're going to have a video here in a little bit that is a cow that was alive when she walked down the fence and laid down and died. So myopathy is, and there's no research on it.
And it's just something where they just absolutely just disintegrate from the stress, more or less. Their muscular structure just disintegrates, right?
Yeah, the pH of the blood changes. There's a lot of symptoms to it that's very clinical, and that's one thing we need, because a lot of times when we're looking at a depredation, there may not even be enough stress or enough trauma on the animal to tell that for sure it was a wolf depredation, because that's the only way we can tell or confirm that it was a wolf depredation is by the trauma to the muscle. Well, that just started the chase.
Now we have an image here also. It's not just cattle involved. Here's a photo of some sheep. Talk about this particular image here. What are we looking at?
This was Sittaway sheep This is one instance where they drove them over, probably chased them for several miles, and they went over a hill and piled up like this, overheated because they obviously have wool. So they overheated from the chase. They went down. Hardly any of these wolves or sheep were consumed. And that's how they kill 176 sheep in one instance, in one night, and don't consume any.
Didn't consume any of these.
I don't believe they consumed maybe one or two, maybe.
Is that the entire flock?
Oh, I doubt it. There was an instance in Montana where a guy lost his entire, he had all of his bucks in the buck pasture, and they killed all 120 of his bucks in one sitting. So,
How many wolves do you think?
oh, who knows? Sometimes it doesn't take very many.
Mm-hmm.
It's
So it's
fear.
incredible stress on the part of the
It's
animal.
fear.
And it depends on the animals too, right? Also, when they had this introduction of wolves into the Yellowstone area there, were there any guarantees or promises of reparations made to any of the ranchers in that area for any losses that would occur? What was told to the ranchers back then?
It was told to the ranchers that we probably wouldn't have very much conflict with livestock, but if there happened to be any, Defenders of Wildlife said, we will compensate you for those losses. And they did. And they not only would compensate for, they'd compensate a full compensation for a positive. There was probables and possibles, and those were a percentage payment. But they would also, at that time, pay on, if you had a historic death loss on your range of 1% or 2%, you would track that. But let's say you had a 4 or 5% death loss while you were on the range, they would pay the difference between 2 and 4 or 5. So they would pay that as well. And I was a county commissioner at the time, and we sat on a panel with Defenders of Wildlife and talking about the credibility and the likelihood that this happened in that area to kind of justify their calculations. And so when those were negotiated, then they would pay. Well, then when wolves were delisted, even though we had exceeded the recovery numbers by maybe tenfold at the time, I believe it was, you might correct me, Scott, but I believe it was by tenfold that we exceeded the recovery numbers. Defenders of Wildlife kept filing suits saying, if you guys delist, we're not going to pay anymore. And they didn't. They went backwards on their word. And when the wolves were delisted, the compensation quit.
That's been going on for how long now?
I think they quit in around when did they delist?
2011.
2011, so they paid till then.
All right, what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break right now, and then when we come back, we'll talk about how this is impacting farmers today and their operations. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back right after this. We wanted to warn you, some of the images and videos you'll be seeing are of a graphic nature, but we are showing them to you to help illustrate the importance of tonight's topic. Welcome back to Rural America Live tonight with Big Game Forever. We're looking at the introduction of wolves to Colorado and the dangers they pose to farmers and their livestock. And we want to turn back now to Scott. We heard of the demise of the Yellowstone elk herd. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that. You were telling me during the break that some of these elk herds is basically gone. How is that possible?
Well, they're being consumed. Sport reflex killing is probably the primary cause, and then lack of recruitment. These wolves specialize in tearing the fetus out of the animals. We simply think that some of them are just simply leaving the area altogether, moving on to the ranches, up the valleys, further harming the ranchers in that valley, putting pressure on them as well. It's the same everywhere, but Yellowstone is the keystone, or probably the park of our nation. But it's also one of the places where the longest study of elk on this continent has occurred. And they've recorded every year all of those elk and their demise, right on paper.
That's just amazing. They're such a huge animal. Just hard to believe that they could disappear like that.
They are. Well, we were fooled, into believing that these wolves were going to balance the elk herd, when all along good scientists out there already provided us the evidence that said otherwise, and that proved true right before our eyes. That's why I flew the aerial survey. I wanted to know for myself, because there's so much corruption in this.
I want to bring into the conversation here our next guest, too, and we have Dr. Val Geist. Thanks for joining us here.
You're welcome.
You mind if I call you Val?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Glad to have you with us here tonight. Made a long trip from British Columbia. Val happens to be a world-renowned biologist and a professor emeritus at the University of Calgary. Just curious, when it comes to Yellowstone, do you think that it actually has become void now of elk and moose?
Well, yes, of course. And the severe decline in wildlife took place much earlier already. In fact, it was very, very quickly that it happened. I was for 1 week in Yellowstone 10 years ago, and we rode from morning to dusk through some of the finest moose country I've ever seen. And I have studied moose, and I've published a book on them. And in these 8 days, we saw not a single moose, we saw not a single track, we saw not a single feeding site. They were gone, absent. And statistically, we find that here now and again, moose does show up, but the reality is that this moose right now, the Shiras moose, is on the way to extinction. The only place that it is found now is where the wolves are not found, such as in Colorado or in Utah at the present time, but in other localities it is a goner. The elk herd, of course, declined from 19,000, and as Scott mentioned quite correctly, it's a very, very well-studied elk herd, and it declined to about 4,000, but the reason it didn't decline even further is because of the 4,000 elk, about 3,500 moved onto private land. And we've had in Canada the similar experiences. When I started studies in Banff in the 1960s, we had about 2,500 elk. Once the wolves came in the 1970s, we went down to 300. But it's not only that we went down to 300. The elk were hiding, the elk were silent. You no longer heard bulls bugling in the valleys.
Really?
No, it's completely gone. And subsequently, what we found is that as the wolves expanded into the foothills, the elk moved, as in Wyoming, onto private land. And the most spectacular part was the moose. They moved literally 30, 40, 50 miles into the prairies and established themselves in the prairies, in the coulees where there were some willows and redwood and Saskatoon berries and so on and so forth. And that was totally new. This happened after I retired. Before that, we've never known that. So that we had a good population now of prairie moose because they're on private land, they're away from wolves, and it's so typical that these animals search out humans for protection once they are threatened. And on Vancouver Island, for instance, we went also, 90% of the deer disappeared. And the remaining 10% are found in cities.
Really?
Yeah. In fact, the deer on Vancouver Island today are virtually confined completely to cities, to farms, to settlements where human beings are. But the same thing is true also here, of course, in Montana, Idaho, and so on. Your little hamlets do contain elk. Gardner, Montana, for instance, has elk at the present time. Didn't have so previously. And what you're looking at is a wildlife desert eventually. And that has happened in my lifetime because I studied in the 1960s in northern British Columbia, in the Spatsizi, what was a wildlife paradise. And today it's a wildlife desert. There is a nicer word for it. It's called a predator pit, which means that there are, finally, neither big game or very, very few big game animals and virtually no predators, because they also die out. And what you have then is a tremendous growth of various vegetation. And please don't forget, when you have the growth of vegetation and it's not being consumed, it becomes fuel. And then the wildfires set in.
And you were talking a little bit ago about the elk, and Scott, you mentioned that too. I think you call it a flight, where they're just leaving their natural habitat. Correct. And they're competing with cattle now, right?
That is
For
correct.
grazing or forage?
Yeah, that is correct. And not only that, they also transmit the diseases because the Yellowstone elk were infected with brucellosis, and they've carried that onto private land.
All right. You had a graph on a little bit ago. I think maybe we can bring that up about the decline in moose numbers.
That's correct.
And I was startled when I saw that. If we can bring that back up here, there it is. 90% moose population decline. What exactly are we looking at here? What are you tracking on this graph?
Well, what we are tracking is the demise of moose, period, and this graph is going to continue on to the bottom.
What area is that representing?
Well, my understanding this is from the Yellowstone area, but right now you have virtually the only place where you can see moose is where the wolves do not exist. That is in Colorado and in Utah.
Wow. Okay. I want to turn to Phil, if you don't mind, for a moment. And Phil, we've seen a lot of Facebook posts dealing with what they call depredation on cattle herds, and I wondered if you could comment on that for a little bit.
Yes, depredations are when wolves kill livestock. And Wildlife Services comes and they do the necropsy or the investigation. In fact, we have a video of that here I'd like to show you.
All right.
It was a coincidence that Idaho Rangeland Commission was there videoing a different issue. We were talking about the cattle we were selling at the time, Akiushi cattle, which are a Japanese breed. They were there videoing that. That night I got a call from our neighbor, said, you got a dead cow on the fence down here. And I just assumed, because it's so often, that that's what it was probably wolf kill. And sure enough, we went up there the next morning. I'd called the trapper the night before, and we went and looked at this cow. And I think we'll show you the video, and then we'll talk about it a
Let's
bit.
take a look at that right now then.
So when we come up here, we'll look for sign, for wolf tracks, for scat, all those things that will lead to this, just part of the evidence. And this is no different than a crime scene. Next thing we do is go right to the carcass and and look for outward signs of teeth marks.
Finding none, they proceeded to skin out the animal and look for bite marks and trauma beneath the skin.
See, like right in here, see how clean that is? That's just like you were going to put her on the rack. There's no marks in here. That's what she should look like all the time, all over. But you get to this, that's a bite mark. You can see where that they got her right there. There's probably going to be another one right underneath here. Once we go down into there, you can see there's a little bit right there, and so that's a consistent bite mark. They didn't hit her real hard there. There's not a lot of hemorrhage there, but that's still, you can see that. You can see where they got a hold over there, and that might have been like that, but my guess is we're going to have something right there too, where they come up and right up underneath there and got a hold of her like that.
All right, Phil, if you could elaborate on that just a little bit. That was actually on your ranch, correct?
Correct.
That particular video there?
Yes.
And when was this?
This was 2 summers, not this summer, but 2 summers before that.
Now, we're showing a baby calf on the screen right now. Is this also on your ranch?
Yes, that's the calves. That's the calf from the mother that we showed earlier.
Oh, really?
Yes, this calf is probably 3-4 months old.
All by itself?
And he's all by himself, looking for mom. Where was she? He happened to walk up there while we were still videoing.
Really?
So, yeah, so here's this calf. He's too young to wean. Mm-hmm. Shouldn't be weaned. He won't do well, but he'll get by. And the cow was completely intact when we got there that morning. In fact, we found a blood trail from where she bled out her nose along the fence. So she walked along that fence. This was after the whole chase was over, the whole event with the wolf was over. She walked down the fence, laid down there, and died, tipped over from myopathy. So that's been a big part of the problem with this is a lot of ranchers are finding cows laying there, assuming they died from something else, poison or disease or whatever. And it's not. It's wolves. There's 2 kinds of myopathy. There's predator myopathy and capture myopathy. Fish and Game, we learned this at a seminar, when they chase and try and capture an animal, an elk, they will stop and abort if it goes on for over 2 minutes because myopathy will set in. Well, you can imagine that's an elk. You can imagine how long it takes to exhaust a cow. Nowhere near 2 minutes. And I have no idea. There's no information on how long typically it takes for this type of myopathy to set in. We need that research.
So walk us through the difficulty in trying to control these, I guess you call them depredating wolves that are attacking your cattle herds in these flocks of sheep out there. What's the hardships here?
The hardship in controlling the wolves,
Yeah.
or identifying.
Yeah, why is it so difficult to control them? Walk us through that.
Okay, Idaho, and this is contrary to Colorado. Colorado, they can't trap, they can't hunt, they can't do anything to control wolves if they're brought into Colorado like they're proposing.
Okay.
In Idaho, since delisting, we have hunting, we have trapping, we have wildlife services to help us. Those are the government employees. And we have the tools we need. And in a little while, we're going to look at another graph showing how much increase there's been in depredations. And our best tool is wildlife services, but quite often we're talking about a government agency. We just went through budget cuts. We just went through hiring freezes. They have an issue with their maintenance on their equipment that sometimes they won't authorize repairs. We've just been without our helicopter, which is a great tool for control actions on wolves. It's been broke down for 6 months. We need it right now. This is when you can do some control actions on wolves in the snow, when you can track wolves, when you can find them. And wildlife services can't provide that, or maybe they can't hire enough people. And so we've got all the tools that have been available to date. And our depredations, as we'll see on this graph a little later, have been going up almost exponentially in the last 3 years.
Really? Can you put a dollar value on this in any way, in what these losses are amounting to?
For livestock?
Yeah, I mean,
Individuals or statewide?
all the stress is on the livestock. How does that translate into dollars lost and lost revenue?
Well, there's several different ways of looking at it. There's actual death loss that is a cost, but there's also loss of gain, because most people in our area, we're getting paid by the pounds we put on. Either when somebody brings cattle and you weigh them in and you weigh them out, or else they're our own cattle and it's the amount of weight you sell that you get paid on. And when wolves are around, you talk about stress. It's the same kind of stress that elk are going through. We've had an instance where we ran into, we had a depredation. The next day we're out there watching for wolves. This is before they got as nocturnal as they are now. They chased a couple, 300 yearlings out of the woods. 3 wolves did, chasing these yearlings. They had one down in the creek. My hired men were trying to get to it. The yearling surrounds the pickup, and they can't get through them to get down there to save the calf that they have down on the creek. They finally do, and they save that calf. And another time, we had 150 head of cows run down a dirt road for 2 miles, run down a paved road for another mile, and run into the corral at 3 o'clock in the morning. They wake up, my hired man wakes up, and the corral's full of cattle. They go to humans. So you have people who are not getting the breed up on their cattle that they expect. And there's ranchers up there now that are landowners who their clients are not going to come back because of the expense of the wolves. So there's some of the revenue issues.
Now, you're obviously not the only one affected in that part of the state. How widespread is that among ranchers? Does everybody have to have a similar situation here?
I've gone over a lot of the state trying to educate a lot of ranchers that don't realize that if an intact animal is there, you need to get wildlife services out and see if it was a wolf kill. And we were in Salmon a couple of years, last fall, not this last fall, but the fall before. They were talking about coming in from the summer pastures 40 cattle short. There's instances in Wyoming I've read in the Capitol Press where they have wolves and they have grizzly bears. They're coming in 10 to 15% short. 10 to 15% death loss.
And as you mentioned before, a lot of times this is not due to anything that's really visible. Just by looking at the animals, sometimes if you do find a carcass out in the pasture along the fence or something like that, you may just assume it may have been natural causes. Maybe it was lightning or something. You can't tell, and that's fascinating. How hard is that to get an expert out there to diagnose that?
Well, Wildlife Service is easy enough to get, but one morning, a guy I partnered with on some cattle, he comes in and he says, I think we got a bloat problem on some yearlings. We got 3 dead yearlings out in this pasture right across from my dad's house.
Okay.
It was within a half a mile. All these depredations were within a half a mile of a Forest Service fire camp where there's 300 people coming and going day and night. The first one's right along the road, the paved road. I don't like people seeing our dead cattle, so I buried it immediately, went out, looked at the next one, and okay. I get to the third one, and I go, Phil, you know better than this. You know you need to get your knife out and take a look and call Wildlife Services if I don't find something. A lot of times I'll look first, see if I can find some trauma. All 3 of those were killed in one night, plus a 6-point bull elk that we found a day or 2 later. And I think all of them were killed one night, and here was within a half mile of Forest Service fire camp.
So what have they told you? What kind of data are they collecting on this?
Who?
The Wildlife Services.
Well, we have a graph here, I think, that they confirm the death losses. And so if that graph there, the graph will show you, is it's dropping down in 2013. That is right after we had hunting and trapping right after they were delisted.
Okay.
And that caused a reduction in depredations for a while because the wolves, I think, got nervous. I think they pulled back, maybe reduced the numbers some. But then you can see that they got bold again. They increased their numbers. They got more nocturnal. They got smarter. And you can see those depredations are almost going up exponentially now. And also, so are the percentage of intact carcasses.
I can see we'll have the apprehension in Colorado with the upcoming vote, and we'll talk about that a little later on. So anyway, we'll go into more detail about that, and Denny, I'm sure you have plenty to talk about that. What we're going to do is we're going to take a quick little break here, and we'll come back and we'll talk more with these gentlemen about the possible introduction of wolves into Colorado, and we'll explain what that's all about when we come back right after this. We want to warn you, some of the images and videos you see are of a graphic nature, but we are showing them to you to help illustrate the importance of today's topic. Welcome back to Rural America Live with Big Game Forever. I want to go back to Dr. Geist once again. And Dr. Geist, we've heard the wolves carry disease. Is there some that we should be wary of right now?
Well, actually, you should be wary of quite a few diseases, but some are worse than others. And one of the absolutely worst ones is called Hydatid disease, which is a parasitic disease in which the eggs, the tiny, tiny eggs of a tapeworm are swallowed either by big game or by human beings, which then grow in the body into enormous cysts and cause unbelievable misery, death, and horrible life. So what we're dealing with is the Hydatid disease. It is caused by an organism called Echinococcus granulosus, which is a tiny, tiny tapeworm that is found in the gut of the wolf or the gut of the dog. And this tiny tapeworm is letting go with eggs, tiny, weensy, teensy eggs, which go into the feces of the wolf and are expelled. And outside the body, this feces dries and the eggs become airborne and volatile and fly around and about. And what normally happens is that an elk or a deer comes by and feeds on the grasses or the vegetation, and they ingest that, and the eggs awaken inside the body. They become larvae. They penetrate the gut wall. They are caught by the first capillary bed, which is the liver. About 80% of the cysts form in the liver, about almost 20% form in the lungs, and a very tiny percentage forms in the brain. If the cyst forms in the brain, that's fatal, completely.
I guess
Not the
I
whole-
have to admit, I haven't personally heard of that disease before. Is that something relatively new,
No.
or what?
It's an ancient disease. It's spread globally. And when I was a graduate student at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, it was mandatory for us to take parasitology, because in those days we had this disease was not that uncommon. In fact, it occurred in northern British Columbia primarily with trappers. Trappers had dog sleds in those days. They fed infected viscera to the dogs. The dogs got the disease, defecated the disease out. They besmirched the harnesses and so on and so forth. The trappers would get this into their mouth. And what happened subsequently, that we had a professor, Professor James Adams, who studied the disease, and he worked in the surgery at the Vancouver General Hospital. And so that we were as students privy not only to this extremely good photography that he made of this horrible disease, but also of the shop talk that took place in those days. Now, what is so terrible about the disease itself is that each cyst grows and grows and grows and grows, occasionally to that size. And it's not only one, but if there are many eggs involved, the whole body cavity may be filled with these cysts. Now, getting rid of these cysts via surgery is very, very difficult. And what makes it even more horrible is that if during the surgery the cyst splits and any of the fluid and any of the inside of the cyst walls gets onto the peritoneum of the patient, another cyst will grow there after surgery.
Now, you were showing several graphics here a little bit
Yes,
ago.
that's
You
a
might
lung.
explain what this is here.
Well, that is one cyst, a big cyst on the lung tissue. And if it is in the brain, and I believe you do have a picture of that, that's a fatal.
Yeah, I believe we have that here.
Yes, that's right.
All right, there it is, right there.
That would have been a fatal disease.
That's
the brain.
amazing that gets that involved from
Yes.
from a
This is
parasite
a
like that.
filthy, filthy disease. And this is a disease that has caused so much fright in Europe that, for instance, under one circumstance, the Finnish army set up light planes with machine guns to machine gun wolves. You see, in my family, a person died of this disease.
Really?
Yes. And for this reason, we were, for instance, my mother and my aunt would never have a dog in the house as a consequence. And so in Russia, in Finland, it was the custom that when people came for a visit, the first thing they got was a great big basin of hot water and soap, and they washed their hands. And that's a very good idea anytime. When you, for instance, handle a wolf, the next thing is you are wearing gloves, actually. If you don't, wash those hands. Don't ever get them even close to your mouth. Yeah. Now, one of the things that you should know is that this disease will infect anybody who gets there, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, or if they're naturalists, or if they are ranchers, it gets them all. And one of the things why the naturalists are particularly endangered is because they're curious. They will come out and they will poke into the wolf feces to find out what the wolf has eaten, the bones and the hair and so on. Well, that liberates a cloud of the... And the very first thing we were taught as graduate students at the University of British Columbia was, do not poke the feces of wolves under any circumstances. There are labs which will not accept feces of wolves, by the way, because of the danger from high-daddy disease. And this was a beautiful picture that you just saw, which Mr. Rockholm provided. And that is that when you have feces on, in this case, I believe it is a golf course, right? It is. Or in lawns and so on and so forth, or the hay fields, yeah? That is a particular danger, because not only will the driver spray the eggs all over the place and possibly inhale them, but if it is hay, it's going to be embedded in the hay, and the person handling the hay later on, it may be sold hundreds of miles away, will carry the disease in the hay bales.
Now, there's another photo right there.
That is from a human
looking at
being.
here?
This is from a nurse herself, yeah. Her husband was a doctor. And there you can see just one single cyst. That is one single cyst opened up. You see how big it is?
Wow.
Now, another danger, particularly in children, when, well, it's not only that the wolf carries the disease, but the real danger arises when a domestic dog, a farm dog, a family dog, a hunting dog, is outside and picks up some of the infected viscera that has been left behind, or an elk dies somewhere on the ranch and nobody knows about it, and the dog goes there and feeds on it. In 7 weeks after he feeds on these cysts, the tapeworm is mature and begins shedding. And so you have in saturation of the lawns, you have the saturation of the runways, walkways, verandas, ultimately the house itself with these eggs. So children, babies in particular, pick this up. Now it's going to take about 5 to 10 years for these cysts to grow. But when they do grow and fill the body cavity and the body cavity becomes twisted, a child playing games like hockey may get hit. The cyst will burst. And the next thing will happen is anaphylactic shock. And about 3% of the children get killed right then and there. Wow. By anaphylactic shock. Yeah? The rest of the children are in for a life of misery. And it was a colleague of mine, not from the United States, I'm from Canada, who stated very, very bluntly in an email to us, he says, who is going to be looking after these patients? Who is going to pay their medical and their funeral costs?
My goodness. No,
this is serious. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
a very serious disease.
That's and you've been working not only in North America but in Europe as well.
Well,
right?
Correct. Now, the point is that the Europeans and Asians have cultures that deal with this disease. They will, for instance, in the Muslim world, dogs are considered unclean. That's because of that disease.
Okay.
They're not allowed into the house. Yeah. And the same thing in Russia and in Finland and so on. The population there is frightened of the disease and is acting in such a fashion as to minimize it. Here in North America, we're totally innocent. Can you imagine what happens when you have a dog in the house that is spreading the disease for 6-7 years?
Yeah. Denny, I want to turn to you for a second. Now that you have wolves entering into Colorado, are you seeing signs of hydatid disease?
Well, it's interesting that, this past February, there was a landowner up in North Park, part of Colorado, that called a division and said, well, there's a moose up here that is stumbling, it's salivating, it just losing hair, this type of thing. So they called the division to come in, and DWM came up there and looked at it and said, well, I think it's CWD, so they shot it and cut the head off, took it down to CSU to have it tested. Didn't have CWD. It had hydatid disease. It had a hydatid cyst in the brain. And so the thing that's really scary for us is that wolves have been migrating into Colorado since 2004, which I told you earlier, we have documentation of that. And so at least for 10 years, we probably had wolves coming in and out of the state, moving in from Wyoming. And so this disease that now has become very prevalent in some of these states, we've got in Idaho and Montana, I think we've got a slide that actually shows this, of the prevalence in those wolves. And these were from tests that were done at the University of Washington, and that some of Scott's friends got involved in and brought wolves up there for testing. And what they found out was that 62% of those wolves in one state and 63% of the wolves in the other state are carrying this hydatid disease.
I understand you actually have a video of a woman that was afflicted with this. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We went up to Idaho, and we'd heard about this lady, and she very graciously, very bravely said, yes, come up and we'll do an interview.
Can we take a look at that?
Absolutely. Let's do.
All right, let's do that.
I've been living in this area for a long time and never once saw a wolf. But eventually, after wolves were introduced in 1996, I started seeing them. At first, I didn't think much of it, but eventually they started causing trouble. I had always been healthy. I believed that if I ate right or active, and that was all I needed to do to take care of myself. In 2001, I got sick, and I didn't know why. I was confused. I was scared. The doctors didn't know what was wrong with me. I kept getting worse. Finally, the doctors found a cyst in my liver, and they drained it, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But when I only got worse after that, eventually, through tests and specialists, we found out that I had contracted the hydatid disease.
All right, Denny, I wanted to go back to you. This is very important because you have an upcoming vote on the issue, right, in Colorado?
Well, right now there's a threat of a ballot initiative that the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project and the Ted Turner Endangered Species Fund are threatening for 2020. And that's why it's so important for us to get out and educate the public about this disease. Our friends from Idaho, Montana have, literally come down and Dr. Geis as well to tell us the dangers of this. And we need to get out and educate the public. So we formed a coalition. The coalition is called Colorado Stop the Wolf Coalition. And so we're looking forward to educating the general public about wolves and the truth about the wolf and not misleading information and the warm fuzzies about wolves. This is a very, very serious situation. And so we're asking the public go to stopthewolf.org. You can learn, you can see the videos that we've seen tonight. And most of all, we need them to donate. It is going to take a tremendous amount of money to fight against the environmental movement. And Scott and Phil know that from being involved with this up north. And if we're going to save Colorado, then people have to get involved. And Scott's told us, and Phil's told us, and other people have told us, if we lose Colorado, we will lose the West. And that's a very serious thing because wolves will disperse into Utah, Kansas, Wyoming, and everybody needs to know the seriousness of this disease.
I'm so glad you brought that up. And before we run out of time totally, in about 30 seconds, Dr. Geis, you had a comment about this.
Well, yes, I think it's an enormous irony that your way of introducing wolves actually destroys them. Because when you put wolves into settled landscapes, it's inevitable that they hybridize with dogs and with coyotes, and that their genetics is destroyed. You are in the process of destroying the real wolf, you and the Europeans as well. That's not nature conservation. That's a scandal.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you're probably open to anyone that has any help to offer. If they get in touch with you, can they get in touch with you through the website?
They can go to stopthewolf.org, and there's a phone number on there for them to contact, or they can get to our webpage, or excuse me, our Facebook page, and of course you can message through that. And we'll be glad to take as much help as we can because we have to stop this. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for Dr. Geis and Scott Rockholm and Phil Davis to be a part of this. It's important that we get out and educate the public.
Well, again, thanks to all you gentlemen for coming in. Very, very important topic and very timely topic. So thanks for sharing all the information with us and our audience tonight. So I appreciate it very much. You're welcome back anytime, all right?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
And that is going to do it for this particular issue of Rural America Live. I thank you so much for joining us. So for that, we'll go ahead and put a wrap on tonight's program, but wish you and yours all the best. Thanks for tuning in to Rural America's most important network.